His secretary, who was his mistress, served me divorce papers at my own award ceremony party in front of everyone. I did not cry. I did not beg. I just smiled, raised my glass, and said, "Thank you all for coming." 3 days later, the whole world found out who I really was. The ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel glittered like a galaxy trapped under a crystal dome. 1,000 chandeliers threw prismatic shards of light across the polished marble floor, and the air thrummed with the low hum of polite conversation punctuated by bursts of applause. The event was the International Women of Influence Gala, an evening where the world's most powerful women gathered to celebrate their achievements, make deals, and, for a few, settle scores. I stood at the podium, microphone in hand, a glass of vintage champagne perched delicately on the podium's brass stand. My name, Rebecca B. Caldwell, glimmered on the screen behind me in bold gold letters. "For years," I began, "I have been told that a woman's place is behind the man, not beside him." The audience murmured, a ripple of recognition crossing the sea of faces. Tonight, I stand here, not because I was allowed, but because I earned my seat at this table. The applause rose, a tide of clapping that seemed to lift the entire room. I took a breath, feeling the weight of a decade of effort and silence settle into the marrow of my bones. I had gone through this speech 100 times in my mind, each rehearsal a small rebellion against the quiet that had characterized my last 6 years. My husband, Ethan Caldwell, the charismatic CEO of Caldwell Industries, had always told me to be his rock. He said I was his anchor, the person who kept him grounded while his mind roamed the clouds of ambition. He had also told me that some things, the way business works, were not meant for women to understand. He had a way of turning his boardroom victories into personal triumphs, and his secretive smiles always carried an unspoken promise. He would always protect me. The doors to the stage opened, and a woman stepped forward. She wore a black sheath dress that whispered against the carpet, her hair slicked back into a tight bun. The room fell silent, the sound of a lone violin drawing a thin line of tension. She placed a silver tray on the podium, and at its center rested a single stark white envelope, divorce papers, brightly contrasted against the dark wood. Ethan's secretary, Mara Whitcomb, stepped into the light. Mara was more than a secretary. She was his confidant, his shadow, and, as the whispers in the hallway of the hotel would later confirm, his mistress for the past 2 years. Her eyes flicked to Ethan, who was standing at the back of the ballroom, his face a mask of polite bewilderment. Mara's voice, low and composed, cut through the silence. "Mrs. Caldwell, I am sorry to interrupt, but the papers are ready." I lifted my gaze, my eyes meeting Mara's. For a moment, everything seemed to slow, the clink of glasses, the soft swish of silk, the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. My heart hammered, not from fear, but from a quiet, almost foreign confidence. Ethan's face turned a shade paler. The applause that had been building moments before dissolved into an uncomfortable murmur. I picked up the envelope with a deliberate, graceful motion, the kind I had practiced in the mirror countless times when rehearsing my speech. I opened it with a single swift motion, as if exposing a hidden truth. The pages fluttered out, legalese and finality, outlining the end of a marriage that had been nothing more than a gilded cage. I held the papers up briefly as a photographer captured the moment. Then I turned to the audience, my smile soft but unwavering. "Thank you all for coming," I said, raising my glass. The sound of clinking crystal filled the room, a toast not just to my success, but to the woman I had finally allowed herself to be. The applause returned, not out of sympathy but out of admiration. Some cheered, some clapped politely, a few whispered, "Who does she think she is?" I let the murmurs wash over me like rain on a window pane. I knew the storm was just beginning. I was not always the woman who could stand on a stage, envelope in hand, and smile. 6 years earlier, I was the quiet partner in a marriage that everyone else seemed to have written into a dream script. Ethan was the kind of man who could walk into a room and make the lights dim, the conversation pause, the world shift its axis to accommodate his presence. When I first met Ethan, I was a junior analyst at a boutique consulting firm, my name a footnote in a sea of numbers. He was a client, a charismatic investor with a reputation for turning startups into Fortune 500 giants. He saw me, in his eyes, as the sharp mind who could translate spreadsheets into stories. He invited me to a dinner that turned into a partnership, a marriage that turned into a brand. Our wedding was extravagant. The ceremony took place in a rose garden, the reception in a ballroom that now looks like a recycled set from movies. The media covered it with a frenzy typically reserved for royalty. Ethan's name was on the guest list for every power conference, his face on the cover of Forbes, his voice on the radio when he spoke about building a better future. After the wedding, the facade of perfection grew. Ethan's public persona, philanthropist, visionary, husband, contrasted starkly with a private one that barely showed the cracks when I looked too closely. It was a delicate dance. I wore the pearls at charity galas. I sat in the audience as he accepted awards. I wrote speeches for him and edited his press releases. I was his invisible partner, present but not seen. When Ethan was away on a business trip, the empty seat at the dinner table was filled by the soft click of a phone. I could hear the muffled laughter, the glow of a screen that was never meant for my eyes. It wasn't until my sister Rachel called me a week after our 4th anniversary that I realized I had been living a lie. "B," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "I saw him. He was with someone else. And it wasn't a colleague. He was with Mara." The words hit me like a cold wind. For a moment, I thought Rachel was joking, that she had misread a scene at a coffee shop, but the tone was final. I confronted Ethan that night. He stared at the floor, his jaw clenched, his eyes flickering between denial and a weary acceptance. It's just business," he said, his voice a low hum that would have sounded sincere in a different context. "We're just friends. It's nothing." The word nothing hung in the air like a stale perfume. I didn't have a platform to scream, no audience to demand explanations. I had become, in his world, a secret. The secret of a happy marriage presented to the world, the secret of a silent woman who never asked a question too sharp. After that night, I made a choice. I would not be the woman who imploded, who threw the heirloom vase against the wall in a tantrum. I would not be the woman who let her heart dissolve into bitterness. I would become a woman who learned to see the places where power moved, the places where money lived, and most importantly, the places where secrets breathed. I began staying late at the office, learning how the numbers in Ethan's accounts could be altered with a single keystroke. I read legal contracts, tax returns, and securities filings in the soft glow of a screen that only I could see. I found patterns, offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, shell corporations holding property in New York, a web of assets that none of the public knew existed. Ethan was a secret millionaire, not just a billionaire on paper. He was the type of man who owned entire neighborhoods and turned them into tax shelters while the rest of the world called him a philanthropist. When Mara came into my life as the secretary, I pretended she was just a colleague. I listened to her laugh, watched her move through the corridors with a confidence that suggested she knew more than she let on. She was a mirror reflecting the hidden parts of Ethan's world. I could have called her a threat. I could have thrown a bottle of wine in her face. I could have written a scathing article in the New York Post with the headline, "Mara Whitcomb, Ethan's Mistress Exposed." But I chose another path. I silently built my own financial independence. While Ethan thought he was hiding assets from me, I was creating a parallel account. I set up a trust, moved money into offshore accounts that were under my name, and began investing. I bought stocks, real estate, and a modest piece of a startup that would later become a multi-billion-dollar tech giant. I became a secret millionaire in my own right, albeit quietly, under the radar. I used the money to foster a network of women in tech and finance, to fund scholarships for girls in underprivileged regions, and to build a private foundation that would later become the backbone of my public persona. I turned the invisibility that Ethan had placed upon me into a strategic advantage. I was a ghost in the boardroom, a phantom in the accounting department, a whisper in the corridors of power. The day I decided to accept the International Women of Influence Award, I had already built a wall of financial independence around myself that no one could see, not even Ethan. I had also chosen my moment, the moment that would force the world to see both the man and the woman for who they truly were. The morning after the gala, headlines scrawled across the front pages of every major newspaper like a broken record. Caldwell's wife serves divorce papers at award ceremony. Photographs captured my smile, Ethan's stunned expression, and Mara's icy stare. The world was buzzing. The internet was flooded with speculation about the cause. Infidelity, a sudden burst of rage, a calculated move. But they did not have the whole story. 3 days later, I stood in a sleek, glass-walled conference room, the city of New York sprawling beneath the floor-to-ceiling windows. Ethan was there, flanked by his attorneys and a few reporters whose microphones dotted the table like tiny beetles. "Ethan," I said, my voice steady, "you have been running a secret empire for the past 15 years. You have hidden assets, offshore accounts, and you have used your influence to manipulate markets, all while presenting yourself as a charitable philanthropist. You have used my name, my reputation, to further your financial ventures." He looked at me, his eyes darting, searching for a sign that I might crumble. "I have my evidence," I continued, sliding a folder across the glossy table. Inside were copies of bank statements, tax filings, a ledger of shell companies, and a series of emails that traced a trail of transactions. A single line item read, "Mara Whitcomb, consulting fees, $3.7 million, 2019 to 2022. He opened the folder, his hands trembling. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the faint hum of the city below. "Rebecca, you have no right." "My right," I interjected, "was to be invisible. My silence was a choice, not a concession." The press room erupted. Reporters shouted questions. The cameras flashed like a storm of fireflies. I could see the shock in their eyes as they realized that the woman they had just seen on stage was not only a victim, but also a powerful figure who had been quietly dismantling the very empire that had tried to keep her in the dark. The next few hours were a blur of statements, legal filings, and the unraveling of Ethan's private empire. My own foundation, previously known only for funding educational programs, was recognized as the source of the largest donation to the Global Climate Initiative, a donation that had been made through a shell company Ethan owned. The world now knew that the philanthropic work attributed to him was, in large part, financed by my own secret wealth. The day after the press conference, the headlines read, "Rebecca Caldwell, the secret millionaire who destroyed a corporate empire." The subhead, "How a wife turned invisible into power." Divorce proceedings were never clean. Ethan's attorneys tried to argue that my allegations were a ploy to gain leverage, that the hidden assets were legally theirs, that I had no claim over the offshore accounts because they were never listed under my name. They tried to paint me as a vigilante who had overstepped the bounds of a legal marriage. But I had already taken steps that no one could easily dispute. The offshore accounts were jointly owned. The shell companies listed me as a beneficial owner in several jurisdictions. My private foundation's board members testified that the majority of the funds originated from the same source, my personal investments, not Ethan's. The courtroom became a stage of its own. The judge, an experienced veteran of corporate law, asked me, "Mrs. Caldwell, why did you stay silent for 6 years?" I lifted my chin, feeling the weight of the room, the eyes of the public watching through the television screens. "Because silence is a weapon." I wasn't waiting for a moment to cry out. I was waiting for a moment to make the world listen. The gavel struck, and the judge's nod was more than a procedural gesture. It was an acknowledgement of the hidden truth. The settlement was unprecedented. Ethan surrendered his controlling interest in several of his companies to a trust overseen by an independent board. His offshore accounts were frozen pending investigation. He was ordered to pay a settlement that exceeded $500 million, a portion of which would be transferred into my foundation to further the causes I had championed in secret. The public reaction was a spectrum. Some hailed me as a heroine, a modern-day Odysseus who navigated treacherous waters and emerged victorious. Women across the globe wrote letters, posted videos, and held gatherings around the world, sharing their own stories of silence, abuse, and hidden empowerment. Others, especially those entrenched in the old guard of corporate power, labeled me a sociopath, accusing me of financial manipulation, revenge, and using the marriage as a stepping stone. Social media threads erupted with hashtags like hashtag Caldwell scandal, hashtag divorce revolution, and hashtag she did it her way, each reflecting a different facet of the conversation. The public reaction was a spectrum. Some hailed me as a heroine, a modern-day Odysseus who navigated treacherous waters and emerged victorious. Women across the globe wrote letters, posted videos, and held gatherings around the world, sharing their own stories of silence, abuse, and hidden empowerment. Others, especially those entrenched in the old guard of corporate power, labeled me a sociopath, accusing me of financial manipulation, revenge, and using the marriage as a stepping stone. Social media threads erupted with hashtags like hashtag Caldwell scandal, hashtag divorce revolution, and hashtag she did it her way, each reflecting a different facet of the conversation. After the divorce settlement, I had built a foundation called Women Who Were Silenced But Refused to Concede. Each grant we award, each story we publish, each podium we hand over to a woman who once thought her voice was a secret is a stitch in the new curtain, one that will never be drawn closed again. The foundation is no longer a refuge. It is a beacon, and I am its reluctant keeper, a steward of the fire that refuses to be smothered. When Ethan called me to dinner, his invitation was a thinly veiled attempt to rewrite the script of our past. He wanted civility. I wanted closure. I declined not out of spite, but because the only script I now follow is written in ink that does not bleed. I have learned that the most dignified rebellion is the quiet refusal to step back onto a stage that no longer belongs to you. The humiliation that seemed inevitable never arrived, because I had already taken the power to dictate my own ending. A year later, we had a celebration gala. As the last echo of applause faded from the night's performance, I felt the weight of the empty seats lift. The audience, those women whose stories have been woven into the fabric of the foundation, were no longer spectators. They were co-authors. The curtains may have fallen that night, but they fell in a way that revealed a backstage filled with voices waiting to be heard. I find my peace, not in the absence of a husband, not in the silence of a past marriage, but in the thunderous chorus of women who, once silenced, now refuse to concede.